Hello, everyone. Yes, so I'm a costume maker. I work on a lot of different things, from sewing, but most of my stuff has 3D printing in it. So, like, I use 3D printing in combination with a bunch of different techniques to make costumes. So, wearables, a little bit of fashion, sewing, painting, foam, all that kind of big stuff, but also like props and masks that are 3D printed. So, I started out as a game artist, and that's where I learned like the 3D from, so like the 3D modeling and everything, and then a natural transition between like the costumes I was making and the game art that I was making was combine those two and do a lot with 3D printing and my own digital 3D model designs to make all these things. And it worked out really well for me. So now I run a full-time business as a costume maker where I create costumes for myself. I create costumes for customers, and I create costumes for big video games and online content. So, like for example, a video game will make a new update with a new character with like a really fancy outfit, and they'll share a 3D design with me, and I make it using my skills in 3D printing and sewing and everything else to complete that costume and post about it online. So you can find me online on Instagram, YouTube, Twitter, Facebook, etc. as Willow Creative, where I share all these builds and how use 3D printing and all these different techniques together to create an outfit, basically. And on top of that, I make like a little bit of extra side money in monetization, selling of 3D print files and 3D prints itself. And that's basically how I sustain my business model. I know a lot of people here are joining with their own ideas about how to create their business with 3D printing and with Elegoo machines, Elegoo materials. And I want to show you a little bit on how to use all these different techniques and how to approach a certain project and complete it to like a full outfit or a full project, like a prop and swords, masks, and all that kind of stuff. And that's my specialty, yeah, and that's what I want to talk about with today. So there's a lot of like things involved when you're making digital designs into reality, basically, and there's a lot of different approaches that you can do, and I highly recommend like following myself and people that use 3D printing to see how they basically create and think about how a certain creation needs to be made, how it's built up from like a sketch, from an idea, all the way to a finalized project. And there's lots of different ways to execute that. So I highly recommend like following loads of people online that do different things in fashion, 3D printing, cosplay, and all that kind of stuff that is related to prop building, outfitting, masks, and all that kind of stuff. Because you'll find that there's lots of different approaches that you can take and see which one suits best for your project. And for that, you need to start with the design. Now, there's lots of 3D printable designs out there today on the internet that might suit you. And sometimes a project or an idea that you have doesn't really fit with any ideas or designs that you can find online and download. So you're going to have to make it yourself in a 3D design program, or you have to find a designer that can design this for you and help you out. Because I was taught as a 3D artist, and it's quite an elaborate profession. So it might take years for you to get like proficient in 3D modeling, 3D design. So it might be more useful to find a designer. For example, everyone that uploads designs, STL files, 3D models online, either they're their own designer, so you can contact them like, hey, I see that you made this mask and put it online for download. Would you be interested in designing a mask for me, and how much that would cost, for example, to make a custom design for you, especially if the mask that you can find online, for example, I'm using a mask as an example, is close to what you want to achieve with your own project. It might be worthwhile to contact the designer, like email them like, hey, do you make designs on request? So this is how you find designers, by finding designs online that closely match what you're looking for, and then see if the designer wants to help you out. For myself, I'm my own designer because I'm a 3D artist. That's how I started out my profession, and so I use a bunch of application software myself that I learned in my 3D artist college and 3D artist degree, and I'm on designs. So, for example, the mask that I want to share with you today, this is a mask 3D printed on the Elegoo Centauri. And I want to show you a little bit on how I made this design for it. And this is Autodesk Maya. This is the final mask already. So, like, this is basically how you would download it. If you remember the QR code from the initial slides, you can go back to that QR code later, but you can download the design and you can try this mask out for yourself. It fits perfectly in the Centauri Carbon, for example. It will fit your most faces in terms of size. This is made in ZBrush and Autodesk Maya, which is what I learned for my 3D artist degree. And one of the first things that I always like to do when I'm making a mask, I start with my face shield 3D scan. This was made with Polycam, and there's lots of 3D scanner apps online nowadays, and especially for iPhone. If you have an iPhone, you can use your LiDAR scanner to create a very detailed 3D scan. And this is how I scale my designs. So even if you download a mask, for example, if you have a facial 3D scan, you can scale the design for your own face and preview this size without wasting a drop of filament, basically. And this is what I start with, is with the face scan. And I make like a sketch based on what I want to make as a final design. I also sometimes, because I run a little shop with selling masks, for example, so I want to make sure that my design fits multiple faces. So I download 3D scans online from real people, and I use these to scale my masks as well. As you can see here, this is a very rough sketch of the mask I wanted to make, and this is made with a sculpting software. So what you do is, if you ever did any kind of digital art, you have like a pen tablet. You can draw this up in ZBrush or Nomad Sculpt, and you can sculpt things basically the same as when you would sculpt clay. So you can move things around and add details. And I basically use the extra TD scans to scale it up, so I can actually like make sure that it fits the people that I'm designing for. For 3D modeling, do you have any links or suggestions for super beginners to learn 3D modeling? Yeah, it is very difficult to get into. It can be quite overwhelming. And as I said before, 3D modeling is a very broad profession, and it can take years to get like really proficient in it. And for starters, I can suggest getting into Blender. Blender is a very large app for 3D modeling. It will span everything from like uh, mesh modeling to like sculpting and everything. So it can be very overwhelming as an app, but Blender is free, and there's so much resources for Blender that you can try and learn from super beginner tutorials in Blender on YouTube, for example. There's a lot of resources for Blender. So I do recommend Blender. I don't use Blender myself, and I'm not very good with it. So I use it to move 3D models around to my own apps, because Autodesk Maya here, what I have and what I was learned in college as a super beginner, I used Autodesk Maya because that's what I was learned in college. But it can be super advanced for beginners. So I do recommend Blender because it's free and there's so many resources. It's a very big community. And I know that on YouTube there is Blender tutorials for super beginners. There's lots of YouTube tutorials out there. So I do recommend Blender for that. And yeah, so Nomad Sculpt is like basically the free version of ZBrush that is also very accessible for beginners that want to learn more organic 3D modeling. So this is an organic 3D model, is where you use a pen tablet to sculpt like clay, basically, which is for in my opinion is sculpt apps like Nomad Sculpt and ZBrush are the best for ZBrush for beginners, because all you have to do is, this is what you start with basically in Nomad Sculpt and ZBrush, and the only thing that you need is a pen tablet, and then you can make shapes on it and draw basically whatever you want. Like, of course, there's a couple of settings that you have to get used to, but there's only like 2 or 3 things that you can that you can play with that is a little bit easier to understand than Blender, for example, in mesh modeling and Autodesk Fusion, for example, which is more of a industrial, super advanced kind of thing. So I do like these sculpt apps like Nomad Sculpt and ZBrush just to play around with and get used to. And then you can get into like things like Blender. I do like Blender because it also allows sculpting while also enabling advanced features later on and get into advanced tutorials. And for this one, like I basically added more details with just sculpting, like all these get sculpted in the. So if you have a tablet, a pen tablet, I really like doing this. It's just a couple hours of letting loose on a facial 3D scan. And then you can basically export it. It will export in OBJ, which most slicers will support, but usually they also have a plugin for 3D printing. For example, you can see it as a STL export. And I basically use Autodesk Maya to add some final details, usually. Which, for example, with 3D printing, I do final details because I want to make this a wearable mask, but I also wanted the jaw to be like moving. So I added a bunch of like holes in it so I can create hinges for this mask. And I also added hooks in it so I can create like little elastic bands to attach to. So that's like a really nice thing with 3D printing is that you can add hooks and hinges and all those details and get like an animatronic shape. So I pre-plan all these things like attaching an elastic band into 3D before I actually finish up the project. So again, if you have an iPhone, you can make a 3D scan. You can also do that with Android phones. They'll just use photos of yourself to generate a 3D model. 3D scan is super useful if you're making any kind of wearable. I actually had myself 3D scanned like full body, which I did at a figure shop. Like you know how you have those 3D print shops that print minifigures of yourself for like a wedding or whatever. They have like a full body 3D scanner, and that's what I did. I asked them like, "Hey, how much is it to make a full body 3D scan of myself?" And then sent me the files for it. And I have like a full body 3D scan now that I can use to scale my costumes to. So this is my full body 3D scan, and I imported a video game 3D model to basically plan my costume completely digitally. Especially with like having a 3D scan of yourself is so useful for creating any sort of wearable costume, anything like that. You can do some kind of research based on what kind of video game you want to try, for example. But you can see here, I can pre-plan everything this in a digital environment before I even make anything. And this is like a super detailed 3D model that I created in ZBrush with all the details in it that it ends up being like used for a 3D printer. And in terms for detail, as you can imagine, it depends a little bit if you're using a filament 3D printer or a resin 3D printer. The resin 3D printer is super detailed, of course, but it can be very heavy and fragile. And of course, a resin 3D printer is a little bit more difficult to size up for a full costume. What you'll see in most slicers is there's going to be a detail. I think it is like based on your general slicer nozzles. You can see here the layer height of 0.2 millimeters, and a nozzle that is 0.4 millimeters. Standard nozzle is 0.4 millimeters, which is very detailed. So this was printed with the standard detailed setting, and as you can see, it's got the details really well. So you don't have to worry too much about it. But if you're doing something like text engraving, that can get a little bit iffy. If you're doing like a super precise text engraving, then you want to do like a resin printer, which can achieve more detail. But for something like this, something organic, something sculpted, you can get quite a lot of detail. And then we'll get to the sanding and the priming and all the filling later. Make sure that everything is detailed enough to translate it to your final project. But it depends a lot about how big it is and how detailed you want to go. And if you want to go really super big and super detailed with like a tiny engraving and everything like that, it might get a little tricky. But that's the trade-off that you have to think about. Do I want to go really big? Do I need to capture a lot of detail? If you want to go to resin for detail, you want to go big, you want to go a filament printer. Yeah, so the Elegoo machines that I do have is the Centauri Carbon and the Saturn 4 Ultra, which is Centauri Carbon, the filament printer. If you want to go big, you want to go lightweight. And the resin printer, if you make small details, jewelry, and I also really like the resin printer for if you need to make anything like translucent and resin, and that needs to be like gems and gemstones and jewelry and all that kind of stuff is really useful for the resin printer. Like for example, this is a very small necklace that I resin printed, and it was just perfect for the resin printer because of the size and the details that I wanted to add without having to sand very much. And for this one as well, this is a bracelet that I designed, and the custom jewelry on top is made with the resin printer because it was just perfect for the details that I had. But if I wanted to make a costume that needed more wearable, more lightweight, and bigger, like for example a mask, I always go for the filament printer. This was printed in ABS on the Centauri Carbon in about 15 hours, and I picked ABS because I wanted to try it out. And ABS is also very great for masks like this that are very difficult to sand, because you can use like an acetone vapor to smooth it out and not have to sand and obstruct all those details. So if you sand and put filler spray over all this, then you might lose some of the detail that you wanted in the mask itself. I also try to, when I design something like this, I try to make the features a little bit more exaggerated. So like all the creases, all the points and all the creases are a little bit deeper than what I want to achieve in real life. Because if you make them deeper and then you fill them up with filler spray, then you get a little bit more contrast back in your final project. So if I sand and fill this, then that means like all the extra deep crevices and all the extra dots and extra ridges, they get flattened out because of the sanding and priming process. So if I exaggerate like the crevices and exaggerate like the points and the horns and everything a little bit more, then I get that contrast back in my final project. So this is ABS because I wanted to try it out. It worked out really well in the Centauri Carbon. And usually I print with PLA because it's easy. And sometimes I print in PETG because PETG has a lot of transparent colors available. And PETG is also a little bit easier to print, like for example, than ABS. But if you want that temperature resistant, then you can still go for PETG because it has a little bit of a higher temperature resistance compared to PLA. And I also print a lot of flexible materials because it's just easy to wear. So, like, for example, this was printed in a flexible material, which is like it can be completely unfolded and everything, and it's super soft and durable. Like I can drop it and shape it and everything. And also because I wanted to put this on my arm, because it's flexible, I can just open it up and put it around my arm. So that's like the advantage of flexible materials, but they're a little bit harder to print, and you need to be a little bit more mindful of the design to make sure that it comes out prints very nicely. I always refer people to the all3dp.com buyer's guide because a lot of people have different needs based on what your project, what you want to be your project to be. So if you want like a really big project, and it also depends on your budget, your space available, and what kind of projects you want to make. So for example, if you want to make jewelry, if you want to make like gemstones and small stuff, then I recommend a resin printer. And if you want to make masks and full body armors, then maybe a filament printer is easier to go with. I have both because I do both, so that's also an option, of course. Yes, so I already talked to you about the materials. I got a bunch of cool stuff with different materials that I can show you. This was 3D printed in PETG, for example, and it is semi-translucent because PETG has a lot of like different colors in translucency. and especially PETG has a lot of selection in translucent colors. And I printed it completely hollow, as you can see. And because it's PETG, it has a little bit of a better temperature resistance because it's so thin. Like, you want to make sure that it is temperature resistant, otherwise this is gonna warp and melt. And I made sure that I designed some kind of opening in there so I can stuff like LEDs and batteries in there and make it like entirely light up. I don't think I have any lights at this moment, but that's what you can do with PETG, for example. Very nice. ABS, as I said before, has a higher temperature resistance. It's a little bit more difficult to print. The Centauri Carbon did a really good job with this one, actually. So I just used a default ABS preset, and it came out really well. And ABS has the advantage of a high temperature resistance, and ABS has the advantage that you can smooth it with acetone, and you can also glue it with acetone, which might be beneficial in some areas. And then the flexible filament, really useful if you want to make something flexible, impact resistant, and make sure that it fits wears very nicely. I made like a very large flexible 3D print. This was a pain to print, and I printed it in 8 different parts. So like every horn was printed separately because that was the easiest way to 3D print it. But now it's also like super flexible. And this is a headpiece, so if I wear it like this and it accidentally falls off my head, then at least it's not going to break. So that's something you want to think about. And it's also very lightweight because it's flexible. I don't have to print with a lot of infill because it's not going to break anyway. So I can print a very lightweight and make sure that I still get a very durable and soft result that I can wear and that is not going to break. I think, oh, here's another flexible print that I want to show you. This is a neck piece. I made it look like metal with metal paint, but it is actually printed in flexible TPU. And so I can put it around my neck and make sure that it fits in one piece. And it worked out really well for this costume because you can just... And again, I used my 3D scan to size it, so it fits absolutely perfect. And I don't have to redo it multiple times. So here you can see on the screen how many pieces I printed it in. And when I cut up my pieces for the costume, because it's not going to fit in one piece, and also the bigger you print in one piece, if you have a failure, you're going to have to start over all the way. So sometimes you just want to print in multiple pieces, especially if you already have an idea of how you're going to glue it together and how you're going to fix the seams. So sometimes it's just a better idea to do it in multiple pieces, especially because I wanted to print this in flexible filament. It had to be printed in multiple pieces to make sure that I had a good success. And by cutting off these horns at an angle, I can make sure that the print orientation is straight up and nice and easy for the 3D printer to work with. And I basically printed all these pieces in flexible filament and make sure that I get like a very lightweight, flexible, durable result. Using the 3D scan, I made sure that everything was the right size. Again, if you're 3D printing for a costume or wearables, what I do recommend is you want to think about your final idea, what kind of results you want to achieve, and which parts of your project need to be 3D printed, and how that design is going to play with your project. For example, if I want to make custom shoes, I'm not going to print the entire shoe as a 3D print, but I'm going to print the parts that I need custom designed. I'm going to 3D print those and make sure that they fit pre-existing shoes, because I know that the art of shoemaking has been proven for years and decades. So I know that the shoes that I'm going to use are going to fit me well without having to go through a 3D design process that might not work out in the end, because the shoe is either going to break or doesn't suit you very well. So if you're making custom shoes, you can 3D print it, but it's quite a process to make sure that it fits well and it walks well. And instead, when I have a little bit of a shorter timeline, I made sure that I just custom design those parts that I want and use a shoe that I already bought as a base. And I approach my projects a lot with this approach in mind, is by modifying existing pieces, proven pieces that I know is going to last and fit me well, without having to spend all that work, all that design, and all those mistakes on designing something as a 3D print when I could just buy a shoe or buy a helmet that already exists. For example, I think I have a heel. The heel that is shown in the video, I already have this. This is a custom 3D design because this design was not available in a shoe, and I needed these two prong heels. And what I did is I made the shell in 3D print, make sure that I have the design as a 3D print customization. And then I disassembled the shoe, see how it attaches to the shoe, and reuse the same techniques that shoemakers use to create my own custom heel. And I filled this with resin, just like a real heel, but I used the 3D print as the custom shape. So just like a real heel, it's filled with plastic resin. It's super durable. Like, I was able to break it, as you can see. It's filled with resin, and I put like a metal stick in it so it can break like this. I was only able to break it where it was not there was no steel, and this in the weakest point, of course. But in here, there's a metal bar with resin, and I used the 3D print as a filled shape to create the custom design. But everything else is like other materials to make sure that it is super durable. And then I wanted to talk about like the post processing to paint something. If you can see this, this is already painted, and you can see here I spot filled a place where I drilled through it, and I used the materials in the screen for this. So when I have a 3D print like this, for example, that comes fresh out of the 3D printer, and you remove the supports, of course, with your snippers that everyone knows, and then to finish your 3D prints, make sure that everything's nice and smooth and painted for your wearables. I like to use this little attachment, which is abrasive polishing brush. I have a list of all these things in the presentation, so you can look it up later. And this is excellent for removing 3D printed lines. And of course, your regular sandpaper or mini sander or anything like that will work very well as well. I like to use these sanding sponges. It is very nice for sanding props and masks that are curved. So you can get a little bit more angle in than just the sandpaper. And then for spot filling, like you can see here, I used spot putty, which is used for car sanding. So for fixing car paint and stuff like this, they use like car putty. And of course, the filler primer, this stuff I use for pretty much everything. And I make sure that I coat my entire 3D print in different layers of filler primer and sanding to make sure that it is smooth enough for my finish. And then you can use any paint you want, honestly. I like using acrylics, spray paints, airbrush, all kinds of paints. As you can see here in the screen, I filled everything with a filler primer spray. It's just basically oversaturated. And I keep sanding and filling until I'm smooth and happy with the finish. I used airbrush paints to paint this mask. Give it a little bit more of an even result with airbrush paint and instead of like a brush paint. And then let me see what else. LED lights, it's just simple Christmas lights basically. And then the visor, I actually saw people resin print visors. You can resin print a clear visor, and if you polish it a lot or put like a gloss varnish on it, you can get it so clear that you can actually look through it if you print it thin enough. I did it traditionally here with plastic vacuum forming to create my visor. It's a custom visor. Of course, I 3D printed the mold for the custom visor as well. And if you 3D print it in a high temperature, then you can mold the custom visor with the 3D print as well. And this helmet was the final. This is the final result of the helmet. Of course, this is a 3D printed helmet, so you can't use it for like actual protection. I had a lot of people ask me, "Oh, can I use it for like motorcycle riding and stuff?" No, it's just decorative, so you can use it for that kind of stuff. I want to show you a little bit more fancy stuff that uses 3D printing for costumes that is a little bit different than you're used to. For example, I'm working on the dragon costume that you've seen here in this preview. You can see this gigantic dragon costume, and of course, you're not going to be able to 3D print this in PLA or something. So I'm developing some new techniques to create this costume. You can see here what I did is I designed a 3D printed pattern. You can download this pattern as well in the QR code that I linked at the start of this presentation, so you can try it out for yourself. And what I did is I sliced it. I added a pause after about 2-3 layers, and then put some mesh fabric on top with magnets on the 3D printer, and then continued printing. And what you get is like this piece of like fabric scales. And then I added some rubber to it and paints. So like this part is without the paint. So I just added rubber, like red rubber with red paint to it. And then this one is with a little bit of paint added. So you can add like shadows and everything. And it's super squishy and because it's printed at TPU. So it's super squishy and flexible. And so I was trying different things on how to make this dragon costume become real. First, I wanted to do like 3D printed molds and make like a full rubber costume by molding and casting it. But I found that wasn't really ideal. And then I thought of this method. So that's what I'm working on right now. And I'm going to show you how to slice this, for example, and with the scales. Let's see if I can find the scales. So you'll be able to find this scales 3D model example. As you can see here, I have the scales here. And I'm going to pick, you can pick a preset. I'm going to use this TPU that I use. Slice it. And it's going to give me a preview of the result. For the mesh, it actually has a few holes in the mesh. So it should be very, like you can see here, there's some holes in the rubber. So it should actually be a very comfortable costume with lots of airflow, which would be nice, honestly, because I've worn a lot of costumes and usually ventilation and cooling in a costume is not my biggest concern. I have to adjust my settings because I don't want a brim. You don't want a brim there, so I'm going to do that. So it actually has some holes that the rubber didn't cover precisely, so it should be a very ventilated costume. Usually ventilation is not my biggest concern with costumes. I usually just power through it at an event, and or I actually have a cool vest that I made myself, which is basically just cool packs in a vest that I sewed up and then I wear under the costume. So for example, if you're doing a 3D scan for a really big costume and you want to wear a cool vest or something underneath, it's a good idea to do a 3D scan while you're wearing the cool vest so you can account for that extra volume of the cool vest underneath your costume. So this is the scales that I printed. And what you want to do with most slicers, you can see like a layer preview. And what you want to do for fabric 3D printing is you go to one of the start layers, and here you can right click in the bottom right, add pause, and then it continues, and then the machine will pause and you can put some fabric in between and it will attach all those scales to the fabric because it will 3D print under the mesh and then above the mesh, and it basically sandwiches the fabric in between. There's a lot of cool creatives that play with this fabric printing, and you can do a lot of neat little tricks with it. You can use a 3D pen to fuse different panels together, or you can just sew them together if you wanted to. You'll be able to download this STL, try it out for yourself. If you have some mesh fabric, pick some up and give that a try. And what else I got? I got a couple more cool things that you can 3D print. This is some scale mail that I made, for example, which is also flexible, of course. And this is actually printed in different sheets and then stitched, well, not stitched together. You do have to resume when you pause the 3D printer in the slicer and you do put that in your G code, you do have to resume manually. But generally, when you add a pause to your print, then you have to check up on the machine anyway because you paused for a reason, right? So if you pause for adding a fabric layer, you have to do that manually, and then you click resume on the printer afterwards when you're done adding your fabric. This is some chainmail. This is a free download on my website as well. This is also very cool for like outfits, and it's also super flexible, modular, so you can add different sheets together and make like a really big pattern. And this is actually like put together as a single 3D print. So like you print these little links individually, and then you put them together afterwards. And then you got like cool stuff like transparent 3D prints. I printed this in multi-material, so I have like an orange 3D printed material inside that is hollow. So you can add LEDs in here and get like a pattern when you're making LEDs, and you can have a special pattern light up. So that's an idea that you can use multi-material for that I really like. And especially if you're printing TPU or some other flexible material, if you use multi-material, you can use different supports for TPU, which makes it a lot easier to print. Other than that, I don't use multicolor printing all that much because I always paint everything. As a costumer, usually you have to paint almost everything anyway. So the colors changing doesn't do too much for me. This is another fabric 3D print that I tried out with some fancy filaments. You can try different bed layers to experiment with effects and get like a translucent effect or a reflective effect. And you can use all these different materials and effects to create a garment, for example, and sew it together. And then, of course, when you're making an outfit, you want to think about adding how to wear it. You rarely, if you have like a full 3D printed outfit, rarely everything is 3D printed. So you wanted to think about adding buckles, adding belts, and all that kind of stuff. I added Velcro to the back of this, for example, which was glued to the back with a little bit of piece of fabric to make sure that I can close it without it being visible. And for example, for this mask, I also made sure that I designed a hole that my elastic band could go into so I can wear it. And I also used extra hardware to make sure that the band's adjustable. And those are all things that you can pre-plan while you're making your 3D design. So here I made hooks for the elastic band, which makes sure that the jaw closes automatically. So all this is pre-designed in the 3D design, and that's something you can take advantage of by incorporating like different materials and different hardware to make sure that your outfit fits and that it is used worn properly without falling off. For example, I also really like to use magnets in my stuff. So I have some horns here, 3D printed horns, and I made a modular horn system where I basically make a hole with a magnet inside, and I have all sorts of different magnets that go precisely in the hole, and it can't rotate. And what I can do is I can then use hardware like a mask or a headband to swap the horns, and I can also swap different designs for the horns, and all I have to do is like take them off the magnet. So those are all things that you can pre-plan for. And also the cool thing is, because they're square, it makes sure that it doesn't rotate, but at the same time you can also switch up the design by rotating the position of the horn. So I can like wear it like this, or wear it more like that, and make like different styles. So you can wear it like that, and you can really switch up the design like that. So we're almost to the end of it. I want to give you a couple more tips for materials that I really like, and such as the primer filler that I use for painting all my stuff. And I also really like my glue that I use for gluing 3D prints together. I always use super glue with accelerant. The accelerant really makes sure that your parts fit together instantly and immediately. And it makes for a very strong bond, even if the parts don't fit precisely together. This accelerant will make sure that the super glue basically glue everything immediately. It is quite fast and quite you have to pay attention that you're gluing it in the right spot because you can't adjust it afterwards. But like the super glue accelerants are amazing for gluing 3D prints. That's basically what I use for glue for everything. And the spray paint, I use filler primer. You can find this in the different brands. It's usually in the automotive section, and you'll be able to find sandpaper there as well. All that kind of stuff that is used to smooth out your 3D prints. And especially if you think about what kind of projects you're making, if you're making something big, masks and stuff like that, props, outfits, then I think a filament printer is probably the best way to go. And you can always supplement with a resin printer later to print like small details. Like for example, some costumes require some really intricate items such as custom buttons, buckles, gemstones, and if you usually you can buy those pre-made, which I always suggest you do because they're just stronger and easier. But if you really want to do like those custom details in your costumes, then a resin printer is really perfect for that because it will be able to replicate and customize those details perfectly. So that's things you want to think about. And these are this is a list of basically everything I do on the daily, everything that I use daily in my 3D printing projects. And if you're going for a resin printer, I do really recommend the Elegoo Mercury, which is a wash and cure set. And I used to run a resin printer without a wash and cure machine. I just washed everything by hand, and the wash and cure set that from Elegoo, it was so much better. Like the results were so much better, not sticky anymore. It was super fast, and it's really worth it if you have a resin printer or want to consider a resin printer. Then get the wash and cure set as well because those machines are really perfect for finishing up those resin prints. Again, the glue I listed here. I listed the abrasive polishing tool. So this is a multi-tool, a Dremel multi-tool, and but you can also buy like different brands of multi-tools that just basically have like all these little sanding brushes on it. Really nice and easy for cleaning up supports and all that kind of stuff. And the spot body, the primer spray, regular paints, pretty much regular paints that I use every time. So acrylics are my favorite because they dry pretty fast. They're easy clean up with water. And then spray paints if I want like a nice even result without too much hand painting. And then I want to give you a list of people that you should follow if you're into costumes, outfits, fashion, all kinds of wearable 3D prints. These are people that I follow for a long time and I've picked up a lot of tips from them. And they share a lot of content that involves 3D printing, and it makes you have a different look on how to approach a certain project. And especially if you're thinking about a project and you can search through these people like, hey, have they made anything similar before, and see what kind of problems they ran into, what kind of solutions they have. And this will greatly help you with whatever kind of project you're thinking about. And of course, I've done a lot of different things in 3D printing, sewing, foam crafting, electronics, all that kind of stuff, and make everything wearable from PLA to flexible and PETG and all that kind of stuff. So I'll be available in a meeting next week. I think we'll find the days soon, and you'll be able to show me your project idea, and I'll be able to give you feedback based on my experience, what kind of solutions I might have for you, what kind of materials you might be able to be interested in, and what kind of approaches you have and want to maybe you already had an idea of how you're going to do your project, and I can give you feedback based on that or give you new ideas or materials that you can see and consider about completing your project and make it easier for yourself without struggling a lot in different solutions and problems that you might run into. So I'll be able to give you some feedback on that. I have done a lot of different projects in the past, so I might be able to match a certain project that I've done before based on what you're trying to make. And I'll be able to give you more feedback on that or give you some videos or content that will be able to match your project and give you an idea of how to approach your project and how to complete that. It gives you a little bit of a direct approach instead of having to look for a certain approach yourself. So yeah, I do recommend following those people. Follow me as well. Lots of content, videos, and things that I share. I always share lots of little free files, design files, and lots of different materials and machines and materials and approaches and techniques from all sorts of things that you can use to put outfits together. Not just 3D printing, but also combining 3D printing with fabric and sewing and electronics and all that kind of stuff, from design to the final result. And so I hope you'll be able to find some inspiration on that. And especially if you also find those other people that I listed before, they make a lot of different things, and you'll be able to find some new ideas for your projects as well. I think that was everything.